So joining us, our next guest joining us today is Kevin Layde. He is a partner at Layde & Para Law Firm, and he is here to talk about immigration and some of the big cases that we've been seeing in the nation, including the case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia. That case has captured the nation's attention as a flashpoint in Donald Trump's push for mass deportation and whether the immigration is following the law and the Constitution in these cases. So here to talk with us again is Kevin Layde, managing partner at the Layde & Para Law Firm. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you for having me on, Dan. Angela, very nice to see you again.
Yeah, you too.
So Kevin joined us a couple months ago on the Recombobulation Area podcast to talk about some of the things that were happening in the early days of the Trump administration. We're starting to see kind of where the rubber meets the road and some of these impacts here. And this case with Kilmar Abrego Garcia has really stood out. So why does this case stand out from so many of the others happening right now? Why is this case particularly significant?
Yeah, so thank you very much for having me on. I really appreciate it. I think that what is happening right now with this individual in particular, but writ large with a lot of folks in the immigrant community, is something pretty unprecedented in my lifetime. And I think that this case is an excellent example of the priorities of the administration and their intentions in terms of how they're going to proceed with these types of plans. So I'd like to start just really briefly with a little bit of historical context, because as kind of like a technical professional in this field, when I see stuff in the media and these different reports and stuff like that, right? I think a lot of the sentiment is correct, but a lot of the specifics are very complicated and sometimes can be kind of lost on a general audience. So
this is why we need to recombobulate on some of these things.
Precisely. So I would say that you really have to start in World War II, honestly, for this, when you're talking about what is asylum and what is the asylum system in the United States. So prior to World War II, the United States did not have any policy for how it would address people who are displaced by things like war and violence and persecution who flee to our country. And obviously there was massive shock, millions of people displaced, millions of people killed during World War II because of a lack of those types of protections. So the idea is that the United States signed on to the United Nations Agreement on Refugees in 1951 in order to make sure that this type of stuff wasn't going to happen again. And what that requires is that our law provides an opportunity, for people who are fleeing from persecution to make a claim here in the United States to be able to assert why they deserve protection and should be allowed to stay here. And that essentially foundational document is the reason why we have all of these types of laws that exist in the United States to this day. Asylum is something that is very popular. One, because it's one of the only things that anyone can apply for. You don't have to have family members here, right? You don't have to have work opportunities or things like that. Simply based on who you are, you have the right to file for this. And so there's a lot of claim that there's a lot of fraud and a lot of abuse in this. People are trying to string their cases along and do different things like that. But that is not the case for Mr. Abrego Garcia. He was detained in the United States when he was here without papers in 2019. He was put into an immigration process where he was denied bond, and he was held in an immigration detention center until he completed an asylum process. At the conclusion of that asylum process, a judge found him ineligible for asylum. I don't know why, but I think it's because he'd been here for a long time, and typically you have to file for asylum quickly after you arrive. But what they did find is that he's eligible for something called withholding of removal. Withholding of removal is an asylum-like claim that is actually more difficult to win. To win asylum, you have to show something like a 10 or 20% chance you'll be harmed when you go back. To win withholding of removal, you have to show a 51+% likelihood. So the United States government, what it did is essentially it gave him a deportation order, but they said that we cannot deport you to El Salvador because it would be too dangerous for you. Because we think more likely than not, something terrible will happen to you if you get sent back. This is a law that is based in the United Nations and based in the Immigration and Nationality Act, which was passed by Congress and signed by the president. What Donald Trump chose to do when it detained Mr. Abrego Garcia and removed him from the country within a matter of days was to completely ignore that order like it never happened and simply to deport him from the United States completely illegally without justification. Since that time, things like this happen, right? And in terms of law enforcement where the wrong person gets, detained or there are errors. But the issue is like, what is the remedy that we have, as a system of laws in this country? And what the Trump administration has essentially said is nothing. They've admitted it was a mistake. They've admitted that he was sent to a country that we explicitly, by our laws, said that he cannot be removed to, and they refused to do anything to bring him back to the United States. That included refusing to turn around an airplane that he was on when it was in the air, when he was being sent to El Salvador. It includes refusing to provide updates to judicial orders about his whereabouts, about his health, and also to return him to the United States. The Supreme Court has sort of weighed in a couple of times on this case already, and they'll be coming back in again. And they've essentially said, in some half measures and using some vague language, they've said that the United States government does have a clear responsibility to facilitate his return to the country. And the Trump administration, what they've chosen to do, Dan, is they've chosen to simply completely ignore these orders and instead go to the court of public opinion to try to paint this person as a terrorist or a criminal. The evidence, in my eyes, is not there for that, like based on what I've read and based on what I've seen. But I think the point that's getting lost is it doesn't matter, because a judge already had the opportunity to review his case and already made the finding that he cannot be deported, regardless of whether he has a domestic violence injunction that was filed against him. That's not the point of this case. The point of this case is that our government has decided that if he goes back, he can be killed. And the fact that our government is refusing to do this and instead is trying to go outside the law is frankly terrifying to me as an immigration legal professional, because if this can happen to him, it can happen to anyone, which is being removed from the country without having the opportunity to have a judge decide if that is legally correct. And that is where we are today.
And that's why people are talking about this in terms of a constitutional crisis, right? Yep. Because what's happening here is that, like you said, through these laws that were established post World War II, that he was, a judge ruled on his case saying one certain thing, and the Trump administration is completely ignoring it. And so I think, like you said, it really does open up this Pandora's box of just like, what else could they possibly do from here?
It's terrifying. I mean, that was what I was going to say. I know there's a lot of like fear, and I don't want us to like sow chaos, but I think that there's a strong sense of like urgency. And a lot of folks are like, okay, we see students being picked up. We see, legal citizens, or even just like the increase in racial profiling. And again, I don't want to like cause a mass panic, but there is some urgency. So I'm wondering how you kind of like balance what is very real, a potential like slippery slope and the dangerous precedent that this is setting now, but also understanding that we're not there yet too.
Yeah, well, so the thing about this case is this, Angela. The executive branch has such broad authority in immigration. They can do so many things. And when the Trump administration was coming into office, we're all sitting around in our immigration lawyer groups talking about what types of terrible stuff they're going to do. They can do things like restrict the number of visas that they issue every year. They can make the criteria and these vetting processes much more strict and arbitrary. Frankly, they can reduce the number of refugee admissions. They can change the laws related to asylum process, all within the legal framework that exists.
And that's much of the stuff that they did in 2016, right?
Correct.
Or in the previous administration. Yeah.
Correct. That is not what's happening right now. I mean, there are things like that going on where they're starting to roll out different types of more policy-based approaches. But what we're seeing right now is, frankly, it's a chaos element. It's an enforcement that is uneven. It's enforcement that is illegal in some cases. That is clearly profiling individuals for their political opinions and perhaps their country of origin or religious backgrounds. And we're seeing a government that is basically just turning loose and saying, who's going to stop us, right? It's like Andrew Jackson said when, famously Donald Trump's kind of inspiration as president said, the Supreme Court can make any rulings they want. They can feel free to enforce them afterwards, right? And once you have that type of a mentality, then I think there's really fundamental problems that can grow out of this in a democracy. And I think, of course, right, immigrants are the group that, they want to go to the court of public opinion because a lot of people talk about how much they don't like, quote unquote, illegal immigrants. And so this is simply a test case, I think. This is a stalking horse for what can come next. And I try not to be an alarmist, Angela, but I really think that we might not be there yet, but let's see how this one goes, because after this, if this is allowed to stand, it is going to be a different country afterwards.
Yeah.
I feel like in so many ways the Trump administration is stress testing the system to see what it's going to allow. And this seems like an especially important test case for, whether our guardrails will hold, whether the rule of law means something, where we are in terms of the Constitution and whether that matters, what separation of powers, all these like fundamental American bedrock, bedrock things. It's so important, and I think we're going to get into a little bit more of it after the break here. But I think, one of the things that I wanted to ask was just what type of impact does this have on the people who are working with you to try and navigate the system legally? I guess we'll have a chance. Sorry, our producer is letting me know that we just have 1 minute before the break here. So we'll get into that after the break. We're talking with Kevin Layde, who is the managing partner at the Layde & Parra law firm. We've been talking here about the case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia and why this case does separate itself from the others, why this is so significant. And we'll get into more of that after the break here. You are listening to the Civic Media Radio Hours. I'm Dan Shafer. Angela Lang is here with me. Kevin Layde is our guest, and we will be back in just a few minutes after the break. Stick with us. Welcome back to the Civic Media Radio Hours. I'm your host this afternoon. My name is Dan Shafer. Thank you so much for joining us today. My co-host in studio at Radio Park in Racine is Angela Lang. And our guest for this segment of the show is Kevin Layde, the managing partner at the Layde & Parra law firm and immigration attorney. We've been talking a little bit about the case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, and why this case is particularly significant. And I wanted to talk to you about this, given all of the headlines about this case, given all the attention that it's getting. When things like this happen, what type of impact does it have on the people who you're working with to try to navigate the system legally, to try to become legal citizens of the United States of America?
Yeah, so I think a lot of that is sort of still playing out at this point because stuff is really going in real time. And I think that sometimes some of the higher level stuff takes a little while to kind of trickle down into people's consciousness. I don't know if that's the case this time, because I think this has gotten some real kind of purchase, both within the community and also sort of like nationally and within the media. I mean, you have senators flying down there and stuff about this. And so, I mean, the biggest thing is I think there's a chilling effect, right? Because I think that everybody that I work with has a path to having legal status in the United States. There's a set of laws that they can follow and a playbook, right, that they can go through that's going to cost a lot of money and take a lot of time and maybe has some inherent risks to it. But on the other side, they'll have lawful status in the United States, right? And so that's the goal that anybody has. It really is to be able to live your life as fully as you can here. But I think what the Trump administration is doing, and I think perhaps intentionally, is to really introduce a lot of uncertainty into a cost-benefit analysis that people have to make. Because if it's going to cost twice as much and you're half as likely as before to be able to get to your goal, and that perhaps there's the risk that this sort of boogeyman can just make you disappear off the street at some point, you're going to be a lot less interested in calling attention to yourself and all the way and going through background checks and being fingerprinted and going through a process, because there's not a lot of trust in the institution that it's going to deliver the result that it says that it's going to deliver. And I think that's maybe a microcosm of a lot of different areas in American life right now. So I've certainly had conversation. I had a conversation with a guy a couple of days ago. He had a 20-some-year-old criminal issue, and I said under Biden you'd have no issue going for your citizenship. I recommended him to wait for 4 years. And so what does that do, right? When it's not just one person who's doing something like that, when you have millions of people who are putting things off, staying in the shadows, being more likely to be victims of workplace exploitation, separated from their families, not able to get as good a jobs to take care of their kids. And so I think the cost of something like this is only going to reveal itself over time.
So I'm curious, and I think I asked a similar question last time we spoke a few months ago, but things have shifted drastically. I'm curious of how folks can feel that they can support the immigrant community, right? Because I think that there's a lot of despair. I think people feel helpless, especially if you are in or outside of the community. And I think in talking to some of my friends, there are some real frustrations around the lack of movements and stances and support from elected officials or other leaders. How can people be supportive in this time?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think from the top down, I think there's a lot of discouragement in the types of, circles that would be supportive of immigrant rights. If you look at what happened, they got this guy, the Trump administration is all the way dug in. They got this guy transferred out of a maximum security hellhole into a better facility through political pressure, right? So even in these time frames, political pressure can still be exerted. And whatever constituents can do to exert political pressure on their politicians to stand up for their constituents, I think is going to be huge. I think beyond that, it's really challenging. I mean, I think that, there's not, at least in Wisconsin, for example, like an immigrant defense justice fund to contribute to, at least not yet, which exists in some other places where it can be like money used to pay lawyers for urgent cases that come up. So I think that's part of it. I mean, I think a big part of it is just like advocating for this in the spaces that we're able to be, that this is important within our communities, so that our elected officials, who really are the people who can kind of make the differences on this type of stuff, can be able to make a difference. The other thing is there's a lot of misinformation and stuff out there, right? And there's a lot of rumors, and a lot of people with green cards aren't traveling at all right now, even though they haven't had issues and things like that. And I think a lot of the chaos is really to try to restrict people's movement and actions. So I think as much as possible, and I guess you guys, particularly as media, I think that's an important responsibility, right? To report on this stuff and report on this stuff accurately, so that people can make the most informed decisions in this time frame.
Oh, that's why we want to have an immigration attorney here on the airwaves on the Civic Media Radio Hours. That's why we're having this conversation. So I think, just given that this case is a certain flashpoint, is there a way in which the case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia represents not just one especially troubling instance, but maybe the tip of the iceberg of greater problems under the surface?
Yeah, definitely. So I'll give you a little bit kind of a different context really fast. There's something called a national registration, which was created by law during World War II to like intern Japanese people and stuff like that, which has then been dormant essentially for a long time, which the Trump administration has recently revived, and basically told all undocumented people that they need to register for this list. Otherwise, they're criminals now. Being undocumented is not a crime until they make it a crime. And so that kind of happened overnight with very little fanfare, meaning that people can be picked up and arrested and detained and put into criminal proceedings for being here without papers. So you're starting to see how they're starting to like push on both ends, right? It's like people who they can't already have in the system, they're picking them up. And then these other people, they're trying to put them on paper, right? And so then, they can start to really try to build this pipeline. At the same time, they're getting more money for enforcement, for apprehensions, expanding detention centers. ICE Milwaukee wants to move to a bigger facility to increase their enforcement capacity. So you're starting to see like the dots are starting to connect. You know what I mean? And so there's a system that's being built. And I think that if it is able to be completed, again, a broken record, we're going to be living in a different country at that point, because your neighbors are going to look different than they would before, right? The kids who go to your kids' schools are going to look different than they would before. The people working on the farms, it's going to be different than it was before. So I think that's the future, guys. I think that's where we're headed.
It's not great. But I think, like you said, it's important for us to continue to have these conversations. It's important for us to dispel misinformation when and where we can. And I think it's important to, highlight cases like this that do become these flashpoints, so that we'll, I don't know, without the public pressure, if we have a senator flying down to El Salvador.
Next time I'm on, you guys can ask me about the Venezuelan hairdresser who was sent to this horrific prison due to a report from a Milwaukee police officer who doesn't have the credibility to be able to testify in state court anymore. So lots to discuss.
Always. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. Our guest has been Kevin Layde, the managing partner at the Layde & Parra law firm. You are listening to the Civic Media Radio Hours. Stick with us. We will be right back.